All right, welcome to this next installment of the Epic Discipleship Lecture. I think when all is said and done, there are going to be like 15 billion videos on this topic, but I'm a Mennonite theologian, so can you blame me? In all seriousness, though, thank you for continuing to respect the limitations of the guidelines that govern this content by refraining from sharing this video with people outside of our class. Um, so it wouldn't be a Melinda video if we didn't review some stuff. So we're going to start by reviewing the contents of this series so far. Again, in the very first part of this video lecture series, I situated the discipleship locus in the larger context of systematic theology and introduced you to a few takes on the theme from historic Peace Church perspectives. And the reason I wanted to do that systematic piece was to help us see how discipleship actually is a kind of cluster or draws together a cluster, or what I've also been describing as a constellation of other theological loci. And I think that we saw that further in part two, where we picked up the theme of Christian living, a term that can be used interchangeably with discipleship, in a more ecumenical conversation, drawing on Ellen Cherry and Michael Battle's essays from Essentials of Christian Theology. Um, among other questions that their essays raised, is this one: what is or should be unique about Christian living compared to other ways of living? I think we also saw there the importance of having a kind of a biblical grounding and a biblical understanding of the human person and human communities that gather around the gospel, as well as spirituality. So it's with all of that under our belt that we're continuing here with part three. My goal here is to give you yet another way to think about the dynamic interplay of theology, spirituality, and ethics. These are the three of the animating principles, I think, of certainly Anabaptist discipleship. I also want to say that as we do a little bit of review here, there are some interesting ways that the conversation around discipleship bridges to, or builds a bridge or connects to, the loci for the locus point for next week, and that is theology of culture. But first, when I talk about this dynamic interplay and integration, what of theology, spirituality, and ethics, what exactly does that mean? Well, we've been saying that theology is our speech about what we understand faith and God to mean, so that an important piece of discipleship is to be able to offer others some kind of account of the theological foundation that underpins your spirituality, with your spirituality representing how you as a believer have a relationship with the non-material reality of the triune God. How do our human spirits connect with God's spirit, or God who is spirit? But the second dimension of spirituality that we also want to be paying attention to is spirituality as human activities. We often refer to these then as practices, rituals, or spiritual disciplines. These human activities intended to promote personal growth for the good of Christian community and to support the integrity of Christian witness on a more global scale, right? So that our spirituality isn't just about our relationship with God, but it's how we are growing and deepening our own faith, how that more mature faith helps contribute to the Christian community or communities that we are part of, and then how in turn that community is helping to support the integrity of Christian witness, the wholeness of Christian witness on a more global scale. Then ethics. I'm thinking about or defining ethics as how humans relate or should relate to each other and the rest of creation in light of biblical and communal understandings of who and what human beings are, right? Would be the additional piece there. So this is what we're working at integrating. And just an additional kind of framing of discipleship that I've been offering goes like this. As human beings, we recognize that God's generative and regenerative grace knits us together as interdependent parts. And because we are interdependent, how we live matters, right? Both the choices that I make as an ethical agent, the ways I seek to grow as a Christian, my spirituality, and how both of those things are shaped by the faith that I profess. Again, discipleship involves integrating theological beliefs, spirituality, and here I'm thinking about the activities, the human activities, rituals, practices, and disciplines, and then ethical frameworks, which is what this particular video lecture is going to emphasize or help flesh out. But I also want to add an additional way of thinking about how discipleship fits into the larger constellation of systematic theology, which is what this methodological framing is about. Integrated discipleship gives us pathways to respond missionally to Jesus' call to love God, neighbor, and self. And here I'm thinking about missional as moving outward rather than inward. And this connects with the painting, the visual image that I've used to symbolize and represent discipleship. So we have the calling of the disciples painted here by He Chi, and I chose this not only because this is in this painting, the artist is capturing this narrative account of Jesus saying, "Hey, walk away from your boats and come help me fish for people." I also chose this because of something I experienced personally while I was in a leadership clinic, learning Mary Schertz's Making 4 Hours Count process a couple of years ago. We looked at this text, the text of the Great Catch, and one of the things that Mary offered us was her own translation of the Greek, where it's not just Jesus doesn't just say, "Hey, come with me and I'll help you, and you will help me fish for people. I'll teach you how to fish for people, catch people." It's, "We will catch and release people for the kingdom," the Basileia tou theou. When I heard that, something inside me changed. And I knew all of a sudden I comprehended in a very different way what I think is at the essence of this idea of being missional. Let's set aside all of the hype and hoo-ha around missional, but in its kind of essential, what is essentially true for me about being missional is that rather than following Jesus, meaning, "Hey, let's go out and catch people and bring them into our churches and populate our congregations," the invitation is to come catch people to release them from whatever is oppressing them and releasing them into this world that God loves and in the reality that God loves them, right? So it's there may be this inward move of catching, but it's for this outward reaching purpose. Okay? So this is part of the reason why I think discipleship matters and how we think theologically about discipleship matters. The other thing that I started to notice too as I was preparing this part of the video lecture series is that in an interesting way, discipleship, and I hadn't quite thought about this before, discipleship builds a bridge from theological anthropology into theology of culture. You'll remember from Hybrid Week that I'm using, again, my handy dandy trusty musty Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms by Donald McKim to define culture. And culture most generally is the description of all human endeavors and activities. That's a pretty big term. But when we hone in and think about what a theology of culture is, Theology of culture involves a couple of things. First, a theology of culture is an understanding of human culture that embraces all the creative achievements of people in light of theological convictions, right? So how do we assess what happens, like what cultural production that humans engage in light of what we believe? When you develop a theology of culture, some of the important issues that you want to bring into focus include views about the nature of different theological topics, um, the nature of a culture in terms of its ideals, goals, and values, how you assess it, right? But another part of it too is how we think about humans' role or function in building culture. One of the things that's been happening in theological language here in the early 21st century is that rather than talking about pacifism, um, pacifist Christians have begun talking about peace, like we're seeing a shift to peace building, which certainly mirrors a lot of non-governmental humanitarian work that's happening in the world. But within kind of churchly contexts, this shift to peace building has gotten us thinking about how we build cultures of peace, both in the church and beyond the church. Like it's this missional activity thing again, right? Um, and in order to talk about building cultures of peace, we need to have a theology of culture to understand how we evaluate the content of a culture as well as what we think about a culture given its ideals, goals, and values. What are those ideals, goals, and values based on and based in? So, I realized that discipleship, to talk about discipleship and to do discipleship and participate in discipleship, involves building culture after a fashion. Like we are building a culture of discipleship that integrates this theology, this spirituality, this ethical way of thinking and reasoning and responding. So um, here we go. I think what I'm about to offer will help concretize what I mean as I'm seeing this link between theology of culture and discipleship. So discipleship and environmental crisis. Now, as you can see here, the slide theme changed. That's because what I'm sharing with you is an edited over time version of a presentation I originally made at the Mennonite Church USA convention in Kansas City, Missouri in 2015. Now that original presentation I titled Not in Anybody's Backyard, The Politics and Ethics of Where Our Garbage Goes. And as you'll see, what I've developed isn't limited just to ethics, or I'm putting ethics into this bigger conversation of discipleship wholeness. So yeah, let's dig in and see where this is going to take us. When I think I called it a workshop. It's a seminar. When I introduced the people who came to attend my seminar to the goals and purpose of the gathering, I listed these things. One goal was to review Anabaptist Mennonite principles of thinking ethically. Another goal that I had for our time together was to think about justice as part of our creation care ethics through watershed discipleship. I wanted seminar participants to learn what questions watershed disciples should ask about what happens to our trash. And then I also wanted to encourage seminar participants to join the Mennonite Creation Care Network, as well as support AMBS's work of preparing leaders for God's shalom making mission in the world, right? Gotta like all this, like, PR stuff that I was doing. So in order to accomplish those last two goals, I dutifully sent around some sign-up sheets to add people's name to the Mennonite Creation Care Network mailing list, as well as getting people on the mailing list for updates about our Rooted and Grounded conference at AMBS. But then I moved more deeply into some of my substantive content. So and I begin here with by talking about theological integration. And there are two dimensions at which we work at this. The first dimension comes right out of the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Knowing is a way of reflecting this call to love God with our minds. Being, loving God with our soul and our strength. Doing, loving our neighbors and loving ourselves. And here, again, I hope you notice how knowing can reflect this triad that we're integrating with discipleship. Knowing represents the theological disciplines, being our spirituality, and doing our ethics or the enactment of the theological disciplines. Now, I also like to show this kind of theological integration by taking each of these three things and turning them into kind of a Venn diagram and identifying that place where they all meet, that sort of sweet spot. That's the place where discipleship is, right? That to be a disciple is to stand at the center of these three activities, expressions, and postures. But let's go back now to catch this second dimension of theological integration. If the first dimension is adding knowing, being, and doing together to equal discipleship, the second dimension involves drawing sources together as well as interdisciplinary study. So as we draw our sources together, we're bringing together scripture, tradition, reason, and the secular disciplines, as well as experience. And then interdisciplinary study describes the way we draw together biblical study, history, theology, and ethics, and practical theology. So here you should recognize the three academic departments that we have here at AMBS. So that theological integration involves, that is discipleship, involves drawing together the lessons that are learned. These departments and these individual courses are not intended to be silos. So, if we're going to talk about theological integration, can we also talk about theological non-integration? So I offered the seminar participants this image, that theological non-integration is like a tossed salad. And what do you see here? Well, when you have a tossed salad, you can tell what the ingredients of the salad are. I see lettuce leaves or maybe mesclun or arugula. I don't know my lettuces that well. I see apple slices. I see grapes that have been sliced, and I see red bell peppers, right? Now, while a salad is a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, theological non-integration is symbolized by this salad because if I wanted to, I could pick the apples out. If I said, "Oh, I don't like grapes in my salad," I could pick the grapes out. This is contrasted with the bowl that you might put this salad in. If theological non-integration is like a tossed salad where you can pick all the parts out and identify exactly what's gone into the salad, you can't do that with this ceramic bowl. I took a ceramics class in college, and and we had very difficult quizzes about clay. So I'm going to try to summon some of that knowledge from my good liberal arts education to explain how theological integration is like this ceramic bowl. So when you make a ceramic bowl, you start off with wet clay. And that clay has actually had to be mixed together from a variety of substances and chemicals so that it will hold its shape when you put it on the wheel or build it with your hands. This happens to be a bowl that was built or made by turning it on a wheel, on a kick wheel. And the next stage that this bowl goes through is it has to air dry to evaporate as much of the water out of the wet clay as possible. Then once it's been air dried and it's what you call greenware, it goes into a kiln for the first firing. That kiln heats up the clay enough that it turns it into what's called bisque. bisque is like, if you think of a flower pot, right? A flower pot, if you put water into it, the clay, the terracotta, will absorb that water, right? And if you put too much in, it'll leak out, right? So after a bisque firing, so greenware goes into a bisque firing, it will still absorb water. Okay, it's not what we call viscous. After the bisque firing, you take the piece and you cover it with a glaze. Now, this glaze is made out of, again, different kinds of chemicals, and what it looks like isn't what, when you put the glaze on the bisque, isn't what it's going to look like when it comes out of the second firing, because all of the things that are in there that help determine its color need a high temperature firing, because that's the particles are going to melt. There's going to be a deep chemical reaction in this fire that will turn the clay from something that is still porous to something that is viscous, something that can hold liquid without the liquid seeping out. So that theological integration is like a ceramic bowl. It requires different stages. There are different components and different ingredients. It's a process. And when you get to the end, while this bowl is fragile and can break, it's not as fragile as the green clay. It's not as fragile as the bisque that came through the first firing. And it has the capacity to hold things without them seeping out. And you can't take the glaze off of the clay anymore, right? Everything has melded together through this firing process so that there is a different level of structural integrity that the bowl has over time. So with theological integration, when knowing, being, and doing are combined, you can't pull them apart. We might be able to distinguish them, to describe them, like I described the stages of this ceramic bowl being created, but you can't pick it apart like you could the salad. From here, I then I offered seminar participants a similar image when it comes to thinking ethically. So if theological integration is like a ceramic bowl, thinking ethically is like making cream of broccoli soup that we put in the bowl. Again, with cream of broccoli soup, you have a recipe and you gather your ingredients and you prepare them, like after washing the head of cauliflower, you chop it up. You probably put some onions in there. There's probably some other seasoning. Maybe there's some additional liquid of some kind. When you look at this bowl of cream of broccoli soup, you don't know what exactly is in there. You have to taste it to see how much pepper, how much salt is in there, how much more might need to be added. But again, like the ceramic bowl and unlike the tossed salad, you cannot, once you have blended all of the ingredients in this soup pot, you can't take the broccoli out anymore. You can't take the onions out. You can't extract the salt or the other liquid and seasoning. So that to think theologically in a discipleship mode is to work at this theological integration so that your ethical reflections, and we could substitute thinking theologically here as well, or enacting spirituality, that it all grows out of this melding together of your theological concepts and ideas and beliefs, your spiritual practices, and how you think about morality, as well as how you enact morality. So moving from integration to ethics. As vessels of God's gifts for the world, we are continually being made and remade. Here I'm drawing on this image of the church as a treasure in earthen vessels. Um, and well, alongside this activity of renewal, of being made and remade, and here I'm thinking about like we can use this image of the, God is the potter and we are the clay, right? At what point do we go into these high temperature firings? And maybe this is kind of like the name process, right? So like maybe I've gone through my life and I've gone through a high temperature firing, but then something happens and I break apart. Theological reflection is that moment where I recognize, okay, I'm in pieces and I've got to figure out how to put the pieces together. And so those pieces can be crushed down into dust that then get mixed back into a new batch of clay, right? So as vessels of God's gifts for the world, the treasure in earthen vessels that the church is, the church is continually being made and remade. We as individuals are continually being made and remade. But alongside this activity of renewal, we also experience the world um, where issues, conflicts, dilemmas, and opportunities abound. Integration is a pattern for meeting experience critically and asking questions to discern viable paths for moving towards God's great shalom. That is, how do we work at catching and releasing, being caught and being released for the basileia to theou? Well, ethics and ecology is one of these places where I think we get to work at this integration in an ongoing way. So how? Well, so it's by asking a question and offering an answer. As creation groans with great travail, as we are in a time of deep ecological crisis, what does it mean to joyfully follow Jesus? And if you're part of Mennonite Church USA, you'll recognize here Mennonite Church USA's tagline. I don't know if it still is our tagline, but it was in 2015. Mennonite Church USA, joyfully following Jesus. Where does Jesus expect us to follow? Um, where does Jesus expect us to follow him to? To the lakes and rivers, to the landfills and barges, to the coops and pastures, is my answer. Which brings us to ecological discipleship.